Anthropocene, which is the title of his presentation. And it is an unofficial unit of geological time used to describe the most recent period in Earth's history when human activity started to have a significant impact on the planet's climate and ecosystem. So think agriculture, mining, all that sort of thing that us humans have done to get ahead in our lives, to show progress. So I'll let Nala introduce Edward, and we'll watch it. But I've already watched this presentation, so it's a great presentation.
In the historic Elgin and
beautiful Davies Packet lobby of Young Street. I'm really pleased to be here to introduce him. He is regarded as one of the world's most accomplished contemporary photographers. Works are included in the collections of 60 major museums around the world. Edward Bartynsky's remarkable depictions of global industrial landscapes represent more than 40 years of bearing witness to the impact of human beings on our planet, with imagery and inspection of the human systems we've imposed onto natural landscapes. Seen through his lens, the term Anthropocene, which describes the period when human activity began to shape the planet's climate and ecosystems, vivid, stark, and complex. For the next 40 minutes, you will hear from Edward Bartynsky, after which I will ask him a few questions about his lecture and his work. His lecture is entitled Anthropocene, the Human Being. Here is Edward Bartynsky.
I'd love to thank Nala for kind words, and John and Beth for their kind words as well. I'm very excited to be here at the Heritage Matters live lecture. This is something I haven't done for a while, as you've all been COVID for a year and a half. So bear with me as I get back to my speaking legs. But this is a really exciting moment for me to speak about something that I rarely get a chance to talk to, but the fact that I came from Ontario. This is my province. I was born in St. Catharines, and I spent my first 19 years there. And that's where I learned photography. And it's also where I fell in love with nature. My father was an avid outdoorsman. We used to go fishing, mushroom picking, and again, we enjoyed the nature around Niagara Falls and St. Catharines. And that was a really interesting time in my life as well, where I got to understand what nature was. And then we got the chance to go into the north and to see, what fishing in the north when we first met some First Nations, and I went muskie fishing for the first time. And I caught a muskie that was almost 20 pounds. It took me half an hour to get it in. And I learned a lot more about what it was to be and to enjoy the north as well, and the Canadian Shield. And I think that, in many ways, was the beginning of my understanding of what nature is, why it's important, and that reference point to where things are, where nature intended to be, where the planet intended things to be. And it's out of that I grew to love taking pictures in nature. And that was the beginning of my work as a photographer. Was a kid running around. I got my first camera when I was 11, and I started taking pictures of the things around me, my friends, put in pictures of their nature. And with that, I thought, could I make a living at this? Could I do something with this? Could I turn this camera into a form of expression? I used to paint with my father as well, and he was very creative. And so together, we learned how to take pictures, how to develop in the darkroom. And then I started taking pictures, far and wide. I continued. And this picture here is me with my canoe, and my father passed away when I was 15. And I got a job at GM, and that job, meant being on the assembly line, and I was able to earn enough money to buy a canoe and a car. And the first thing I did with that money was to go north and to really begin my life as a canoeist, an adventurer, going out into the world, exploring. that exploration really led me to decide that I wanted to learn more about how to be a great photographer and how to make this something that could be considered an art form. At that time, in the early 70s, it wasn't very much considered something that was used as reportage, for portraits, for weddings, but as an art form, it was still kind of early days. And I needed to kind of put myself through school, so I came to Ryerson here in Toronto when I was 20. And to afford that at that time, without any assistance, I worked in the mines as well, in the underground mining in Red Lake, and saw that as an incredible opening of my eyes to the scale of industry in Canada and abroad. And I also was able to earn enough money to put myself into Ryerson, where in my first year I met a teacher here, Rob Gublar, who was probably the most instrumental and important teacher in my career. And he really took a bond to me, and he really wanted to see me go further than the other classmates, and he pushed me hard. And one of the first assignments he gave me was to go out and photograph, and gave the class, go out and photograph evidence of man. This is 1976. And as I started thinking about that idea, I thought, well, what can I do with this? And it brought me back to St. Catharines, where there were remnants of the Welland Canal all through the city that I remember seeing as a kid riding my bike. And I went back and started shooting this with a large format black and white camera, 4x5, with a hood over my head. And I went to start making these pictures of the old Welland Canal. And in the making of those pictures and the critiques of making those pictures, I really realized that with a camera, you can be the kind of alien. So go out and photograph evidence of man gave me that ticket, gave me that license to really begin to think, like, if I was an alien from another planet and I had to come here and show what we as humans were doing to the planet, what would I photograph? And that's where I began to go back to my early days, or the days of working the assembly lines and working in the mines. I tried shooting nature, and I thought, okay, nature is, I love doing it, I love being there, but in many ways, that's not going to bring me to the place I need to. It's not going to make me feel as if I'm in keeping with my time, that it felt nostalgic, even though I love doing it. And I thought, well, how do I change my practice? How do I go beyond that? So I started thinking about photographing how we're transforming the planet. And it happened almost by accident. I was in Pennsylvania, and I made a wrong turn, and I had to cut back through a highway, and I ended up in a town called Frackville. And this picture here shows you what I saw there. And it was a coal mining town, and these birch trees were popping up through the slag heaps. And I stood on this mound, and I looked around, and I saw nothing but a transformed landscape, transformed by the coal mining industry. And I took a series of pictures, and I got back to Toronto, and I processed my film, and I started that winter looking at what I wanted to print. And it was those pictures of the mines that really jumped out. Even though everything else was about nature, this was about the mines. And I thought, maybe I could just go and start to photograph how we transformed that landscape. And that began my work to looking at the altered landscapes. And in 1983, I got a grant, and I set out to do a project called Breaking Ground, and it dealt with homesteads, rail cuts, and mining. And those three projects really opened up. This is a mine that I photographed near Butte, Montana, and it's a little boy with his dogs playing in this hostile environment that was at one point a scrubby, arid landscape, but now been completely transformed into a mine. And this mining tailings area is where people came back to. So at one point there was a town there, the town was completely moved, and then they moved the town back once the mine had gone through the area. And yet the boy doesn't recognize that he's living in this bleak landscape. He's entranced with his dog. And to me, that was a picture that was very poignant, and the resilience of humans. And we can live in many, adapt to many kinds of environments. And as long as he's there with his dogs, he's a happy boy. And that was something that I found really interesting in photography, to find these kind of moments. I then looked at also the idea of rail cuts, that I was reading Pierre Berton's The Last Spike and reading about the making of the rail across Canada to British Columbia. And at one point I got a chance to raft down the Thompson River, and as I was going down, everybody was looking at the 12-foot standing waves, and I was looking at the walls on each side of the river and trying to figure out where to stand to photograph these incredible engineering feats of a line of rail going through this hostile landscape, one of the greatest feats of engineering and rail building in North America at the time. And so I did this series called Rail Cuts, which went on to be one that I was identified for years and years, and one of my first really successful series. And I was interested about what those rails were doing, and I was looking at the logging industry. These are some images from history, and I was very much taken by a lot of the historical photography. Can kind of transport us to the things that we use every day, but we don't actually get a chance to experience or see, and the scale of that taking, and the actual removal of those trees from the landscape. So I really did take those things in when I studied photography here in Toronto at Ryerson, and absorb them into my work and into my way of thinking as well. This image here is an image in Elliott Lake. I heard that all the mines were closing in Elliott Lake, and I wanted to go there and photograph the uranium mining. They would produce yellowcake for the nuclear industry, and at that time, yellowcake was being dumped on the market by Russia, and all the Canadian operations had to close. They couldn't afford to continue to mine at the cost of what they can get, or what they could get returns for the yellowcake. So this was an abandoned area, and this was an area where the landscape, where that tailings pond had breached the uranium tailings and washed through a forest area. And it reminded me of these early images I saw of deforestation and the loss of forests. And it was a phenomenal metaphor for both mining and the loss of biodiversity and the loss of forests in one image. And then I got a chance to talk my way in, and this was also a really important part of my work, was I'd arrive at a mine and I would try to convince them that, you know, I was interested in photographing what they were doing. I'm not environmentalist. I'm not here as a journalist or to report bad behavior. I'm here to show the scale of the operations that they were doing, and that, in fact, my research told me that this was the biggest copper mine in the world, and that I would love to capture it on a large format camera. And by and large, most of the miners, or most of the people in the industry, the general managers, let me in. In this particular case, it was outside of Salt Lake City, and it was the Bingham Valley, and it is considered still one of the largest open pit copper mines in the world. And I was framing it up and I was photographing it, and when I started to think about what I was seeing, I began to understand something else about what I was trying to capture with my camera. And that if we look back in 200-300 years ago, and the Kantian notion of the sublime, that sublime was this notion that nature, this omnipresent force that could come in and sink a ship or destroy a town, and we were awestruck and diminished by that force. But when I looked at this mine, I looked at this picture in Bingham Valley of the Kennecott copper mine, I realized that we are now a force on nature, that with the invention of the internal combustion engine, and with that mechanical advantage that it gave us, we are creating worlds that we are dwarfed within it ourselves. And if you even think of ourselves walking through a city like Toronto or New York, we are dwarfed by the buildings. We are these small players in a large theater of our making. And that I thought that it's interesting to maybe think that my work is teasing out what could be considered the next sublime, which is the force of humanity on the planet becoming the omnipresent force of the planet and now shifting the planet. And this thinking was back in 1983. So it really gave me a strong calling to pursue that idea, even though in those early 80s, it was very difficult to make a living at it. And I had to work other jobs and keep working and doing things to save up enough money to do a trip. And of course, the grants at the time were from the Canada Council were also very, very useful in that they allowed me some funds to be able to travel across the country and do my work for long periods of time. And it was at a time when things were very differently, priced as well, where a gallon of gas was 50 cents and a hotel or motel would be $15. So it was a very different time. And so a grant could take me around the country in a very efficient way. And my early work was always exploratory. It was learning about things, finding out where things were, going to areas where I knew mining was and asking locals and working my way into it. And then around 1985, I created that body of work and I almost stopped working for 4 or 5 years to start a business in color printing so I can stabilize my income and be able to, continue to do my work, but I didn't want to be a photographer. I didn't want to be a camera for hire. I wanted to keep my camera as something that I create my art with. So in 1990, I felt, okay, the business is doing okay. I was being encouraged by some of my collectors at the time that I should go out and start doing more work, that they saw the earlier work that I was doing and they said, look, if you don't get back to your work, you'll be doing a disservice to yourself and the world at large. My collector that came to me said, this is some of the more important work I've seen of artists doing and with photography today. And he said, what would you do if you could just get away from your work right now and what you're building up right here and do? And I said, I'd want to go photograph quarries. I've never seen dimensional stone quarries, but I'd like to go and photograph them. And he said, well, you should. And there's a lot of them in Vermont. And he started sending me brochures. And in a way, he kind of got me restarted again. And I went back to those quarries in Vermont. And in my mind, I imagined that these quarries, if I found the right ones, would represent the inverse of a skyscraper, that these were blocks, stone taken from the ground, a cube at a time, and that this would be like the yin to the yang to our skyscrapers. I was looking for these deep holes that we took up mechanically and very carefully through engineering and removed them a block at a time. And I ended up in Barrie, Vermont, and did a whole series on quarries, and I spent 17 years in 8 different countries, and I produced a whole book on quarries after that as well. And I kept expanding my thinking, and then I started looking at transportation. I went to a place, I did some reading, and there was a book or a short story by John McPhee, and it was a short collection called Irons in the Fire, and this essay was called Duty of Care, and it was all about the largest tire pile in California, 35 million tires. And he described the landscape through words, and I said, I need to go there. And then, months later, I was at that tire pile making photographs of it. And then it was no more than about 3 months after I photographed it that lightning struck the pile and it burned for over 2 years, so it's no longer there. I then started thinking about the recycling of all the things that happened, the other end game of all things that we make. They end up in dumps or they end up in recycling yards. So I started exploring recycling yards in the early 90s all around Toronto and Hamilton. And then I heard about, and actually it was in a CBC's IDEA program, that I heard about the accident that happened with Exxon Valdez. And what happened there was a ship's captain who had happened to be drinking, as the story goes, went off course and ran aground. And what happened after that was it tore a hole into the side of the hull of the ship. It was a single-hulled ship, and gushed out this thick crude that ended up coating about 100 miles of the coast of BC and up into Alaska as the waves and as the westerlies brought the oil to the shore. And it created an environmental disaster that had never been experienced at that scale before. So I was listening to this program, and they had the insurance companies there speaking about the fact that they couldn't prevent human error to have something like this happening again. There's no prevention for that. But the only way it could have been prevented is with a double-hulled ship. If that double-hulled ship would have hit that rock, it would have broken and breached the first hull, but the second hull would be safe, and they wouldn't have the spill. And that was interesting, but what was mostly interesting was that in 2005, they said we're no longer going to insure single-hulled ships. So there's going to be a bounty of these single-hulled ships, the largest vessels ever built by humans, that are going to be broken because they have no more use in the future. And my question was, where are they going to break these ships? And my first research took me to India, and then I couldn't get into that breaking yard because they were afraid of photography and the publicity, but I did manage to get into a shipbreaking yard in Chittagong in Bangladesh. So I did a whole series in 2000 and 2001 on shipbreaking, and at the same time, photography is starting to come into the museum world. It's being more and more accepted. And I arrived with the shipbreaking work in 2002 and 2003 with new dealers in New York. And that's really, I would think, where I feel is the beginning of my international career, and where I can begin to stand back from having to work to keep my art going, to actually letting my art is allowing me to do the work through sales. So as I started to gain my international confidence and going around the world and trying to find the kinds of images that I feel would be interesting to describe what I want to describe, which is the scale of humanity and what we're doing, and how industries are this yin to our yang, the consequence of our lives here is growing, and that the ages of man, from the Stone Age to the Iron Age and the Bronze Age and the Copper Age, are all still alive and with us at a scale that's almost unimaginable. And that's where I wanted to go and find those places that were almost unimaginable. And part of that research was to find the largest examples, to find the biggest copper mine, to find the biggest iron ore mine, to find the biggest smelting plant. And here I'm in Shanghai photographing the Shanghai Steel, which is the largest steel manufacturer in the world. And I managed to get in there as well. And a lot of this is a lot of negotiations to get into these places. And this is also Shanghai Steel with the coal pile. So the making of steel involves a lot of coal. So I stopped along on the backyards of the steel plant and saw the mountains of coal with the stacks that they needed to burn the coal and to make the steel, to melt it and to coke it and to do all the processes that it's necessary to make steel. And I made this image, which feels like a pyramid or an ancient period, but it's black. And it represents one of the greatest threats to the planet today, the burning of coal. I also went to some of the biggest factories. This is a picture of me standing on a forklift to get the shot for the cover shot of the China book. So again, I'm employing more and more devices and getting more confident in the ideas that I was trying to express about globalism, and how globalism is actually can be defined very simply as a search for cheap and the least expensive and the trainable employees, that you find a place where the environmental laws are lax, and if the tax laws through an economic zone are created, then any company that's making shoes or phones or anything that's electronic can set up shop in China. They would have these three advantages, and anybody not moving to China to compete with them would eventually lose their business. So to me, I saw that was a force of globalism. And I began to look at these factories that were basically machines unbolted from the West, the floors of factories from the West, put on ships and taken to China, bolted back down on their floors in a tax-free, environmental, deregulated, and with a workforce of 1.3 billion at that time, with many of them willing to work at menial labor for $3, $2 a day. Sometimes it got up to $5 a day, but it was in that range. So it was interesting to go to that place, to show it, and to be able to see what the scale of these factories looked like. And here you're looking at a factory that made coffee makers. They made over 3 million coffee makers a year. It's Yupa, it's the name of the factory. And they not only made that, they made all the George Foreman grills in the world out of here. And they also built and made about 2 million irons for ironing. And I asked them at the time, how much does it cost coming out of here for an iron? And it cost them about $3 to $4 to make an iron, which would sell at Canadian Tire here for $25, $30. So you can see the kinds of margins that work in taking your manufacturing to a place like China. Also in China, I was fascinated by the Three Gorges Dam, the largest dam being built in the world. In fact, that was one of the first pieces of research I was doing. I had never photographed a dam, and I thought, well, this dam is one of the largest ever attempted. It still is the largest. I don't think anybody will ever try one larger. The Aswan Dam at that time had created 12,000 megawatts, and this was going to be a 28,000 megawatt dam, which is now complete and has been operating for over a decade. So I managed to get into that dam over a period of 5 or 6 years, about 4 different times. I also looked at the recycling that was coming from the West to China, the computer boards that were being harvested for all the chips and all the precious metals on the boards. This is an image of all the boards that have been stripped of all of the chips and lying now in the side of a ditch and left as waste because they couldn't quite find a way to recycle all the boards. Oil was another big project that I took on after doing China. I thought, well, what is driving all of this? What is the thing that allows the world to operate at this scale? And to me, it was the internal combustion engine and the vast quantities of oil at our reserves. This ancient sun that's been stored under the Earth's crust, that we have found ways to tap into it and to produce it at quantities that can provide for transportation of ships and cars and planes. But I thought about it and I thought, well, I was having like an oil epiphany on my way to Sudbury to do a shoot. It's around 1996, and I said, well, everything I'm touching here, my steering wheel's made out of plastic. I had a raincoat because it was raining at the day, and it was like a plastic. And you know, I looked everywhere, and I realized that even in the making of my glass that I'm looking through has probably been touched by oil as well. But I don't know what that oil landscape looks like, just like I didn't know until I got there myself what a mine, an open pit copper mine looked like, or what a factory in China looked like. So I decided to embark on using my camera to describe oil culture. And I thought of it both in the landscape of oil and in this image here is also the culture of oil. This is a drive-through area in Pennsylvania where almost every logo of fast food and oil companies are represented, because it's this area called Breezewood in Pennsylvania where there's a half a kilometer of highway or just roadway between a federal turnpike and a state highway. And in that small gap, they found that it was a perfect place to put up franchises, hotels, motels, McDonald's, et cetera, gas stations. And there's no town around it. There's no town for 10 kilometers around this particular site. And people have to come in to work there. But they found it, and they also now found since then 10 other places where this gap exists, and they create this franchise alley. And here I photographed that alley. And I also, in the oil, I was looking at the scale of cars and production. So I went to the ports in Houston and saw where all the cars are being dropped off for sale in the United States from Europe. I looked at the infrastructure of highways. So I went and I thought, well, one of the biggest and busiest highways in LA, and LA might quite frankly be the beginning of the freeway, and I think it is. And the car culture, the subways and the subways were shut down, but the urban sprawl that happened was a result of no subways, of no public transit, and the highway systems. And if anybody's been to LA, it's very hard to navigate that city if you don't own a car. And so I tried to photograph these highways from the ground and trying to find high vantage points, and it didn't work. So I realized at that moment that I needed to get elevation, something that a helicopter could help me with. So it was around 2003 was the first time that I actually hired a helicopter to take an image that I wanted to take of this highway system in LA. So that was really the beginning of my aerial work, was in 2003 as well. And then through California, I went to the origins, of where oil was discovered, and the first gusher happened, which is in Southern California. And I looked at this area that had over 15,000 pump jacks. And these pump jacks are, once the pressure of the oil is finished, there's still lots of oil down below in the layers in which it's found. And by heating those layers, by pumping steam down there, hot steam, and giving it some time, it becomes viscous again, and then they can pump it up. So these oil wells have been pumped now for almost a century, and there's still lots of oil to be found there through the method of steaming the oil underground and then getting it up to the surface. I also went to the oil sands in Canada and looked at that as a vast geoengineering project and vast mining project where we're taking the surface, almost the first 20, 30 feet off the surface, and then getting to the oil sands, which is an ancient seabed that goes from northern Alberta all the way down to the Texas Panhandle, but it's close to the surface in northern Alberta, and that's why it's mineable. And they feel there's close to 1 trillion barrels of oil trapped in that northern region, but with a known access to over 200 billion barrels, one of the biggest known reserves in the world after Saudi Arabia. So I went to photograph that vast territory and that area of mining in Canada. And this is again in the early 2000s. I also looked at refineries and as these kind of engineering cathedrals to the creation of all we use: plastics, oils, lubricants, fertilizers, and did a whole series on refineries as well. This is an oil tanker that moves oil from Saudi Arabia into US and into Canada. And this also, rarely do I do it, but I photographed the oil spill, the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. And this is the ship that drilled that hole, is now trying to drill the relief hole with the oil spilling around it. And this is some of that spill showed in the delta of the Mississippi River where it was flowing. And you can see this double tragedy where not only was the oil going across that landscape, that ocean surface water, but this ocean water was also this bright green, which is an algae bloom, which is a problem with all the fertilizers coming down the Mississippi and creating problems with algae blooms at the mouth of the Mississippi. And after doing oil, I did the water project, looked at dams. This is a dam in China, the largest arch dam in the world that leads into the Yangtze River. And arch dams are dams that have a curvature pinned into mountains. And so when the pressure of the water from the reservoir pushes at it, it locks it all in place and secures it. So it secures the reservoir from collapsing. And then they have the Three Gorges Dam is a gravity dam, which is just a massive concrete wall that holds back the reservoir. And I looked at water, both distressed water. This is a geothermal operation in Mexico where the water is being purified and being put back into the system. So it's not necessarily a negative, it's geothermal energy, but it also uses vast quantities of water, and that water picks up a lot of calcium, and they need to process it to get it back to a useful water. And I also looked at the idea that water brings urbanism into life, and this is an image alongside a First Nations reserve near Scottsdale, Arizona, and these are all the homes and the pools that have just butt up against that reserve. So for me, it's another way to show that with water, and this is water from the Colorado River as well as from groundwater. So when you bring water into a desert region, you can totally reclaim it and make it a paradise. The only ingredient is necessary is water. I also looked at ancient water and how we used it. These are step wells in India. This is an image that I'm also rarely showing, is an image of making of that picture, which I used a 50-foot telescopic pole that you pump up with a remote on it with a camera and fiber optic, and I was able to operate my digital camera from a computer below to make these images at in a point of view that no one had ever attempted before. So I understood the scale. I had drawings of all these step wells, and then I got the optics and figured all these things out before I went to India to execute the shoot of these step wells. I also went to the Kumela Festival in India, where 10 million people in this case gathered for once every 4 years. They gather on the Yangtze River, and it's a phenomenal experience. And there's a belief system that because they believe in reincarnation, that by dunking yourself on the closest to the holy day in the Yangtze River 3 times, you can release your ancestors from one life form if they've passed away into the next life, because they believe in reincarnation. So they all come to aid their ancestors to make the passage to their next life. And also in the West, I show the pleasure of the beach pleasure and looking from above, showing life along a beach in Spain, where people go to vacation, and the umbrellas and the color and all of that. So again, I'm trying to understand and tell stories of both the culture and how we adapt and how we use water in the whole project with that. I also looked at agriculture, which is the largest use of water that humans do. And this picture shows a division between what was there, what nature intended, and with the addition of water from the Colorado River, you now have some of the most plentiful and rich alfalfa fields in the world. And this image shows pivot irrigation, where these circles that you're looking at could be up to 1 mile in diameter, about 650 acres per circle. And this is where they grow a lot of food for the animals that we eat. In fact, 70% of the food raised or grown on these pivot irrigation circles are used to feed animals, mostly cattle, but also sheep and pigs. This is another pivot irrigation in southern Arizona. This is a picture of me shooting some of the agricultural projects that I've done. This is me in Spain shooting, and this is what I'm looking at, which are these incredible dryland farming images where they're using the climate and the natural water that comes, and that's why it's called dryland farming. There's no irrigation, and working with the seasons to be able to produce the crops that they do. Also in southern Spain, Almeria, this is an area where they have greenhouses, some of the greatest expanses of greenhouses in all of Europe, and they provide vegetables and salads to Europe throughout the year. This is in Saudi Arabia, pivot irrigations. Also, I wanted to show sustainable farming. These were rice paddies in China, and these rice paddies have been going now for over 3,000 years and can continue. And the way they recycle life in them and the way they plant and extract the rice, it can go on for 3,000 more years. Sadly, this sustainable method of farming is falling apart because the youth don't want to work as hard in these fields as it is to make a sustainable, and it's like subsistence farming. You can make enough to eat and survive and maybe raise your family, but that's it. There's no extra there. So the youth want to go further. They don't want that limited life. I also looked at aquaculture in China. Aquaculture is basically the raising of fish in waters through pens, and this is the largest area in all of the world, the Fujian province, and China represents about 70% of aqua farming, of raising of fish protein in waters in pens. And then I moved to the final project that I want to talk a bit about, which is the Anthropocene Project, which kind of brings all of these ideas together, and a film with Jennifer Baichweld and Nick DePonce was created over a 5-year period. And this image talks about deep time. We went to Spain, and we went to Spain to an area called Zuma, where you can see about 60 million years of sediment. And in that sediment, you can see one spot where the dinosaurs disappeared, and we had the 5th great extinction. And this area was about 1 inch thick. It was an inch area. And what it represented was the effect of a 6 kilometer, I believe, in diameter meteor that hit off the coast of Mexico and creating a cloud of iridium that took about a decade to settle back from the stratosphere to settle back to Earth. And in that decade, all photosynthesis had collapsed. So all the large mammals and all the large dinosaurs disappeared in that period of time. And this is where they did a golden spike. They said, here's where that evidence of that fallout happened. This is 65 million years ago. This is the marker for the extinction of the dinosaurs. And I was there with the chief stratologist in the world. And they were trying to, and pondering what is the marker for the Anthropocene, if indeed we have created a whole new epoch. What is the marker? And the closest that they feel there is the fallout of all the nuclear activity we did from the beginning of Trinity and the 2,000 atmospheric nuclear bombs that were detonated over a 20, 30-year period. That precipitation of all that radioactivity can be found on the tops of Mount Everest, to the poles, also into coral. They've actually been able to slice coral and be able to read radioactivity from that period. So in many ways, this is a marker just like that iridium marker that may be one that can appear around the planet, and to define that this is the definition of the epoch change, where humans are now the slow moving, not as fast as a meteor impact, but having the same effect as a meteor impact over time to the atmosphere and to the planet. And see, these are some images from the Zuma area. And then in terms of searching for things, what I learned at the time is what these geologists were looking for is, in the future, let's say a million years from now, what would they be looking for to identify the period of the human epoch? And cement is the number one thing that we leave behind as something that nature doesn't create, that can be found everywhere, followed by plastic. So these are again showing these break wall. They're called delosis, and they're put on the shores to prevent storms from breaking up the shores and maintaining shores. This is an image of blocks of aluminum that we recycle aluminum. So aluminum is also a technofossil. Plastics. This is in Nairobi, a Dandora dump, which is one of the largest dumps of plastic. And people live there, children are born there. There are movies made of this place. We went there and spent a week photographing this plastic dump area. These are plastic bottles being sorted in that area. Urbanization, that's another part of the Anthropocene, the evidence we leave of all the cities, the glass, the towers, the skyscrapers, the buildings, also something that would be found in strata. And they're always looking at things that would give a future geologist looking at strata evidence of, oh, we're here at this point in geological time. So this is also one of the largest growing cities at the time in Africa, Lagos. This is a notorious intersection in Lagos. This is in LA, again, looking at urban sprawl and highway systems going through urban sprawl. And one of the fastest growing areas when I was in China was Shanghai, and this is a picture of all the towers going off into infinity in Shanghai. Deforestation is yet another form, not as evident in the Anthropocene because it's hard to tell, but they would be able to tell that the nature of the soils had changed, that there's no longer a biodiverse forest, that it's now been turned into a monoculture, and the soils had changed their characteristics from further down. So this is, again, things that I was learning as to what a geologist is thinking about when they're trying to define, are we now in the Anthropocene or not? This is a deforestation of, this is in Borneo, in northern Borneo, and a deforestation of tropical rainforest to convert to palm plantations, which is happening all across the southeast area of the world. These are trees being harvested in Lagos and be turned into their homes and all the building material that they need for building one of the fastest growing cities in the world. Extraction, something that I've been already comfortable in doing, which is mining and quarrying, and this is one of the largest marble quarries in the world, Carrera Marble Quarries. There's a large iron ore mine iron ore and copper mine in the southern United States. And this was also a huge mining operation for coal that I found in Germany. So this is in central Germany, mining for brown coal, and a company called RWE was willing to let us in to photograph the largest excavating machine ever built on the planet. And they're using that to excavate the topsoil to get down to the coal seam. And I went into underground mines in Russia. This is an underground mine in Russia, where they're mining for potash and for fertilizer for farming. And these are some of the very surreal things that I found. These are about 1,000 feet underground in Siberia, in a town near called Berezniki. And again, we spent about a week down there trying to photograph and create images. And energy is also a really important part of the Anthropocene, that it's the burning of the fossil fuels and the evidence that it's leaving in both the amount of carbon, the CO2 in the atmosphere that can be found in ice samples and ice cores, but also the transformation of the planet as a result of oil. This is near the Niger Delta, where it's all gone wrong, and Shell have been trying to get oil out of there, and they've been in battle with the locals ever since they got there. And this area that I'm photographing is literally a battleground between the local people who have lost their way of living and the oil companies trying to extract oil out of there, and the governments haven't gone in to compensate those who were there before, therefore leading to the kind of problems that they see in the Niger Delta. I also did a look at a positive look at where energy can be going. This is a solar field in Spain, where solar is concentrated onto and heats salt and melts it to the point where it can store energy for use at night. Wind turbines, this is also something I captured in Spain. This is in the Atacama Desert, and this is lithium mining, whereas now lithium is used for all our cars and batteries, and the whole explosion of cars is happening now as a result, and the need for EV and batteries is necessary. This is an image of 3 Mile Island, where the disaster occurred over 30 years ago. The two evaporating stacks on the left are where the accident occurred, and the ones on the right are still operating. But nuclear also is one of the power energies, one of the energies that have base load that can actually deal with what's necessary for us to be able to support the kind of world that we built with electricity. And then extinction. We went to, one of the ways to show extinction was what was happening to the elephants in Africa, and they were being hunted for their tusks, and this was something that Kenya, the government of Kenya decided to do, which is to burn all of the tusks that were taken from the poachers in one evening to make a statement that this is not tolerated. So the tusks of over 10,000 elephants were stacked and all put to fire on one evening, which in the movie Anthropocene is the opening scene of the movie Anthropocene. So this was being able to tell the story of extinction, but it's over something which is, a product that we have now actually found ways to replace with, like cue balls used to be made of ivory tusk and keyboards for pianos, but that's been now taken over by composite plastics and that have the same quality over 40, 50 years ago. So it's only really used as ornamentation for bracelets and jewelry and ornaments on shelves, etc. And all these elephants, these magnificent animals, are being hunted and killed for those tusks. So it was this kind of senseless extinction that was happening, and it had to do with human behavior and human values. And we thought it was an interesting way to begin to tell that story. So this is us trying to capture that tusk pile the day before it burned with thousands of images and then recompose it as a 3D image, which we did and showed at the Anthropocene exhibition, a 3D image of the tusk pile the day before it burned. Also, we used drones to photograph and flying over the burning tusk piles, as this is showing me at work as well, capturing that. And this is the day after, where the tusks had burned, and it was just these smoldering pyres of these tusks, and you can still see evidence of them in the fires. And the other thing I wanted to talk about was that one of the things that was being shred, and what we brought forward in the Anthropocene Project, was biodiversity. And we were looking at the fact that there are places still amongst us that are pure nature, the mountains. And this was also on Vancouver Island, where we went to Port Renfrew and Cathedral Grove to capture what a forest looks like before we come in and harvest the wood, the big trees from it. And that this is what a biodiverse forest floor looks like. So we wanted to show that that biodiversity exists. This is an image in Komodo Island of some of the most fantastic coral in the world. And this is a coral wall that starts at about 60 feet underwater and ends at about 80 feet underwater. And I was able to capture that and reproduce it one-to-one in the museum show, so you can walk up to it and see every last fish and every last piece of coral on the image as a 10-foot high by 20-foot wide image. This is a close-up of that coral wall. And excuse me, I have to put my glasses on because I wanted to read just to end it. So I'm going to read a quote from Wendell Berry, and to end this with. And I'm going to show you a small snippet right after that of In the Wake of Progress, which is a project I've been working on for the last 2 years. And we just released a film on that project. And the film is of the piece being shown in Dundas Square. It showed about 6 weeks ago, where we were there with a film crew and captured it. And it's a 20-minute thought piece about the square, and beginning with the forest, and then taking us through much of my work over the last 40 years, and then ending back at the forest as well. And it's to speak about really the importance of paying attention to nature. And this quote from Wendell Berry really struck something in me. We do not need to plan or devise a world of the future if we take care of the world of the present. The future will have received full justice from us. A good future is implicit in the soils, forests, grasslands, marshes, deserts, mountains, rivers, lakes, and oceans that we have now, and in the good things of human culture that we have now. The only valid futurology available to us is to take care of those things. And I'm going to end with a piece from In the Wake of Progress. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hey, Mark, you're muted.
Really would have been the first photos that we had for the current year. From our presentation. So feel free if you have any questions, comments. Online, I'm not sure how that's going to work. People raise their hands.
Yeah, we can try that. We've had a couple of times when the Wi-Fi cut out on the tubes.
Okay, looks like a section one, or a section like that. All right. And I'm sorry, I should have put down the photographer's name of the region, but I'll correct that over the next one. Okay.
Actually, no,
I don't have to.
no, it's going to be enough. But why, you can, but it would have to be up cover if you want to be, right? You can do it anonymously, so.
Okay. We'll carry on. Questions, comments? Yes, absence of comments, aren't you just advance to the next one? Yeah.
That was my picture, and I got the ball game, even though they filed, like, those down there. I'm down there, and I have those, 6 or 8 pictures of them, but I just didn't know more. But, yeah, and that little girl, she could hold her own, you know, hold the community.
So they should have moved a little bit closer, a little faster.
So,
Looks happy.
Throw the ball down, throw the ball.
I don't know if they did funny, but I thought it was very good. And whoever took it did a really great job making sure that the bird doesn't focus, that you can see the wing. So whoever took the right, I thought she did. Okay, all the time.
Definitely.
Good job.
Bullet. The bullet bird. That's like that. Looks beautiful, doesn't it? Somebody doesn't look very happy there.
Yeah, no.
It was really cold. Grandma was trying to add hot water, but we only had so much, so.
Oh, the one over. Oh.
That one's mine. It was a movie. It was neat.
That one? Which one was that?
This one's from the movie. So the camera guy is kind of blurry. He was moving and he's off to the left. And that was like one of the hair makeup girls in the bottom right. And they had the whole driveway set up with director chairs. I didn't have a lot of space to be, but the kids rode their bikes past for this shot again and again and again. And that was about the best I could get, I think, of this kid. It was tricky, but it was neat.
You can see the boom microphone over to the left there. Yeah. Now that you say that's the movie, you see that. Yeah.
Yeah. And the girl with the clapping board is against the fence.
You know what they were shooting?
Pardon?
Do you know what they were shooting?
Yeah, they actually filmed through my yard. We got to be extras and our ice cream truck got to be in it. It's called Before I Change My Mind. And it was in production this summer. One of the co-writers and director grew up in our neighborhood. And it's a movie set in 1987. It's a film about a kid moving to the area and trying to find their way, and these kids are bullies chasing them. It's kind of neat. 1987 in Red Deer.
Pretty interesting.
To get a chance to take an
Hang on, I'll get you to rewind, please.
This one is my name's Debbie, and I just finished taking an Ellisburg Park photography course for Birds in Action. And the first time in my life, I learned how to set TV. And we were there that weekend, and about 2 days later, this golf was past me, and I've never been able to get that. So if they offer again, it's a very good course for the afternoon. It's done by one of the directors.
Nicely done.
So what training you have, TV, one was 50, and then F9, 10 to 11. I never forget.
Thank you.
And I cheated a little bit. This is my granddaughter, she was moving with the swing, but I just thought we needed some more motion. So, Photoshop has a wonderful filter called, I think it's the radio filter, and I did that. So, okay.
Good job.
I had commented on there, I'm like, that's a really great picture, I wonder how you did that. That was me. So now I know how you did that, yeah.
We're over secrets now.
That's why we're here.
Yeah. That's it. Wait a minute, that's the last one. Any comments? Questions?
I thought they all displayed like, I thought that was very, very well done.
I agree. The next one, which has just finished, is creative shutter speed. We just compiled all the notes now. And we're getting the comments back. And then as soon as they're done, then we'll do the next presentation. I understand that we will not be having a meeting in December, right, Mark? Just the winter conference, right? Yeah, just the winter contest. And so we'll be showing the next assignment photos, the last meeting in this month, so 2 weeks from today.
Yeah, and is one.
Sorry, the December meeting is going to be Zoom session for the winter conference. Good question, thank you. Any other questions, comments? All right, well done, photographers. Thank you for submitting. Thank you, Mark.
All right. Does everybody want to go watch that last 30 minutes of Q&A from the other? Okay. All right. I guess that concludes this. It's just chit chat in the room. Okay. Thanks, everybody.